Okay, I think it's gone 9. Apologies, we're a few minutes late on our side trying to solve some technical problems. But welcome, good morning to everyone in South Africa. Good afternoon to Brian and John, who are in Sydney, not Sydney, Perth, Australia. And and the topic today is about creative audio, and I'm going to introduce our speakers. Brian, he actually, I think, cut his teeth radio-wise in Radio Pulpit, and he's survived. And he's the founding director of Avena Leadership Institute, an initiative of the Carey Group, committed to fostering leaders who make a positive impact on the world. I think that's what we need. I really like, he's also an author. I like the title. I love the titles of his books. The Tortoise Usually Wins, Biblical Reflections on Quiet Leadership. And then the more recent book, Why Christianity is Probably True, helping to shift the tone of discussion about faith. So I'm very excited to hear what Brian has got to share with us today. We also have John Bergmann. John is the project manager for Avena Leadership, and his focus on quality outcomes and broad picture thinking, bringing professionalism and creativity to each new project. John, it's good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
We have with us, Natalie says, about 20 participants altogether, and not everyone has their videos on. I think it's not, can everyone just put videos on if possible at the start, just so that we can see each other? You don't need to keep them on throughout the presentation. GNCR there, it's the Christian station in Durban. We've got Walk Through the Bible. We've got Cape Pulpit, Impact Radio, News Scoop, which is a news agency serving the community stations, CBN, South Africa, Big 9 ICT, it's a consultancy agency, TBN Africa, I represent Director Radio Consulting, and as I've said, Good News Community Radio. I think that Jan Otto is Radio Alpha. That's another one of our Christian community stations. So good to have everyone here, and we're excited to get into the presentation. The presentation will go on till about 10 o'clock our time, and as it's going on, please jot your questions onto the chat, and then we'll go through them and answer the questions between 10 and 10:30. I think that's about all I need to say. Over to you, Brian and John. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your welcome. It's a real privilege to be here today. I'll say a little bit more about myself in just a moment, but I'm working together with John Bergmann, who's my colleague here at Avena Leadership. And John, you just quickly want to say hello. And John will come a little bit later on in the presentation, and we'll be leading some parts of it as well. So John, say hi.
Hi, everybody. Great to be here. Thanks for having us from all the way over in Perth, which is the island within an island, protected from COVID until now. But yeah, great privilege to be here and to be able to talk about some really important things.
So I'm really pleased to be with you today on many levels. As Deb was saying, I cut my teeth in Christian media in South Africa. I was principal of Rosebank Bible College for a couple of years, and during that time I used to present Rosebank Rendezvous, which was a half-hour slot that came on every Friday morning, was broadcast on Radio Pulpit, and then was rebroadcast on Transworld Radio. And we interviewed a number of amazing people in that time, and I'm always very grateful for those experiences. I grew up in Durbs by the sea, so it feels almost like I'm back in home territory. I do live in Perth now and have for quite a long time. If you were to say to me, why why am I really interested in this topic of Christian media? I think part of it is because I've realized that it's something that God is really using in a significant way today. So I was principal of a theological college here in Perth for 17 years, and then just about a year ago, stepped out and helped found the Avenir Leadership Institute. And that institute, one of its clients is Christian Arts and Media Australia. And as we started to work with Christian Media and Arts Australia, we looked into the work that they were doing and realized that within Christian radio here in Australia and Christian TV, their viewership and listenership represents twice as many people in any given month. It's twice as many people tune into a Christian radio station or TV station as attend a church. So if you were to actually say, where's the voice of Christian faith being heard in Australia today, a significant part of that answer is actually through Christian media. In Australia, as I say, it's several million people. It's double the number of, it's comfortably more than double the number of people who will go to church in a given month. And therefore, radio and media has something of the mantle of saying, actually, we have some of the spiritual oversight of the country in our grasp, because, we're the people that, we're the media that people are tuning into. And that's a very, very serious responsibility. And in a time where, and I don't know how it's going in South Africa at the moment, but at a time where within our own sector, kind of a church land, we see attendances at church just getting lower and lower and lower, we find actually that more and more people are tuning into Christian media. So you realize this is really very strategic, and it really is very, very important. And it makes me think, so if this is something that God is doing, how can we make sure that what it does is done really well? In addition, within Avenir itself, we've worked on a number of media projects. So we produced the Open Book project, which is a biblical literacy project. And in doing that, we started to realize that media can actually shape the way in which people think and can have a huge impact. It's a project that's been used to promote biblical literacy among staff who work in Christian schools. We'll show you a snippet from it a little bit later on and show something of the work that we actually do. Now, today we've been given this topic of creating effective Christian content, creating effective Christian content. And the academic in me wants to say, okay, well, let's just check what those words are. So it's about creating. It's not about pinching other people's media. It's about content that is effective, and it's about content that is Christian. And I guess I'd like to start by just asking this, and it might almost seem like an obvious question, but it's a really important question. What makes something Christian? How do we know that content is actually Christian? And the thesis that we want to work from today is that we want to suggest that it is Christian because in some way it reflects truth, it reflects goodness, and it reflects beauty. Now, if you're into Greek philosophy, you might kind of recognize that and say, oh, isn't that Plato who said that actually we should look for things that constitute truth, goodness, and beauty? And you're quite right. It was Plato who originally suggests this. But the reality is that if you use a Christian frame to think through those two categories or these three lenses of truth, goodness, and beauty, you recognize that you come out perhaps in quite a different place to the place that you might have come out otherwise. Because the Christian idea of truth is not exactly the same as the Grecian idea of truth. Christian idea of goodness is not the same as the Grecian idea of goodness. Christian idea of beauty is not the same as a Grecian idea of beauty. And so we want to suggest that if you create content, you dig into it and you ask this question. So not only is this content effective, whatever effective might mean, and not only is it creative, but it is actually Christian. And what makes it Christian? Is it simply because we throw in some Bible verses at regular intervals? Is it because we throw in the name Jesus quite often? Is it because the sinner's prayer is used at some point? What makes Christian media Christian? And we want to suggest that it is, as we use these three lenses, as we say, so to what extent is the content that we are producing, to what extent does it reflect truth? To what extent does it reflect goodness? And to what extent does it reflect beauty? And if we're in the process of content creation, we have people who utilize our imaginations, and we imagine, and that's the gift God gives to us. And we undergird everything that we have with hope. And so if you look at the slide there, we suggest that the Christian lens to use is the lens of truth, goodness, and beauty. But overarching that is this encapsulated imagination, which we set free to use. And we do that undergirding everything with Christian hope, which is resurrection hope. And we start to ask, so in what way is the content that we're producing reflecting truth, goodness, and beauty? Now, as content creators, we are called to be prophets. In other words, our content must have a prophetic challenge in some way. It must say, is this the world that God actually wants? It should be poetic in the sense that it should be beautiful in some way. And it should be pastoral. It should really care for people. It should help people in their journey, especially as if in South Africa, as I say in Australia, we actually are pastoring people who in their millions are not going to church, but in their millions are watching Christian media. So we have to say, to what extent are we the prophets for them? To what extent are we the poets for them? To what extent are we the pastors for them? And each of those three is really important. But let's just say, what does the creation of content look like if we say, let's use the lens of truth, What is a Christian understanding of truth? And of course, when you talk about truth from a biblical perspective, you recognize quite quickly that whereas we might say that truth is propositional, and historically we might have thought in terms of propositional truth, so 2 + 2 = 4 is true, 2 + 2 = 5 is not true. Now, that's just a straightforward proposition. We might traditionally have thought like that, but Jesus doesn't allow us to stop there. When Jesus talks about truth, he says what in John chapter 14, verse 6, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. So you immediately recognize that truth from a biblical perspective, or truth from a Christian perspective, is relational truth. It's about the truth of relationship, but with all the complexity that's involved in that. Now, what does that mean in practice? Well, think about the way you see stories and what makes a story true. Well, the story is true depending on the lens you bring to it, and you ask, are the relationships that have been picked up there truthful in some way? Let me try and give some examples. Take Luke chapter 21. It's the story of Jesus. He's in the temple and he sees that there are rich people, and those rich people are putting in extraordinarily large sums of money into the temple treasury. And you imagine everyone kind of watching them and saying, wow, this is so exciting. This is a glorious day for the temple. The rich are putting their offerings in, and we can imagine that the dividend from this, it will be astonishing. We'll be able to do so many things. There's a great story here about this great day for the temple. The rich gave their riches to the temple. We can do so many things. But even as they're doing that, we're told that there's this widow who comes in and she feels really awkward about what she's doing. She has very little money. The Bible describes it as 2 mites, like the smallest currency that you could possibly have. And she kind of sneaks past and she drops her 2 little coins in. And Jesus, who's watching this scenario, says, there are 2 stories here. There's the story of the rich people, and most people say, wow, that's the true story. That's what's really happening here. The fortunes of the temple are going to be changed forever here because of these enormous gifts. But Jesus says, no, actually the true story is actually the story of this widow who drops in almost nothing, but it is everything that she has. Now that is the transforming story. It is the story of someone who trusts God so deeply that they give everything that they have. That's a beautiful story, and that's a profoundly true story. And Jesus suggests to us that actually when you look for stories, and in media, we are storytellers, we are poets, we are singers of songs, we do all this creative stuff, and we're constantly having to tell stories, and the stories we tell will shape the world, because as people hear stories, they're actually being told this matters, and the stories that don't get told, well, those apparently are stories that don't really matter very much. And Jesus is saying, so look for the truthful. You know, what's the true story? You can see the story of the rich people and you can tell that story, or you can do what I, as Jesus, choose to do. You can see the story of the widow and the 2 mites. That's the story I choose to tell. Or take another story, the story of Zacchaeus. Like we told as children the story, aren't we? This short little man, and he's a tax collector, and he wants to see Jesus, and no one will let him get to the front, and so he can't see. So he climbs up a tree, and he sees Jesus from that lofty height. And Jesus spots him and says, Zacchaeus, come down, and I want to have lunch with you today. And he goes and has a meal in Zacchaeus' house. I mean, the truth of that story is that Zacchaeus was a despicable human being who had been, as a tax collector, exploiting the poor and the oppressed and those who were under Roman rule and pinching money from them. And the truth of his life was that you could look at him and say, despicable sellout. Someone that really you must keep behind the queue. He happens to be short, so that's very convenient. Don't let him see anything. But Jesus looks and he sees that there's another story there. There's a story of a man who could actually become a very generous human being. And all it would take would be an encounter with Jesus, and everything would be transformed for him. And of course, we know the account. That's just what happens. And so Zacchaeus goes and he has lunch with Jesus and is completely transformed. And this man who was so despicable becomes this man who's generous, because a new story becomes possible for him. Now, what am I saying? Jesus says, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. Now, truth is relational. And in relationship with me, there is another story that can actually come to the fore. Now we are creators of stories. What stories are we telling? What stories do we help to shape? What stories do we make possible? What stories do we privilege? Do we see the true stories? And do we use the filter that Jesus uses? Because the filter of Jesus is not actually the same as everyone else, and he spots what other people have missed. Having said that, as creators of media, we need to recognize that if you're a story writer, for example, there basically are, people have argued that there's 7 basic storylines that keep coming back over and over again. And we can think of what they are. 4 of them, for example, are, in terms of very common story themes, are the theme of finding home. And so many stories are about finding home, aren't they? You can think of Finding Nemo and finding the way home. And other stories are about overcoming the monster. And I mean, every James Bond movie is about overcoming the monsters. The world is deeply threatened and we've got to overcome this great peril that's actually there. Or there's stories about rebirth. And this film like Despicable Me is about rebirth and someone actually finding a new possibility for life. Or these stories about rags to riches, that's the Cinderella story. So, I mean, I could go on with different storylines, but when we create content, we should always ask ourselves, so what is the basic storyline that's coming through here? And in Christian media, very, very often that storyline is the storyline of finding home. And one way or another, it is about how do you find home? And we say, well, actually, God is our truest home of all. And so Christian media often points to people coming home. But remember, truth is relational. And the moment truth is relational, it actually gets very complicated because people are complicated. And life is often quite messy. And a criticism, and I hope it's an unfair criticism, but a criticism that I've often heard of Christian media is that sometimes we tell our stories in such a way that they become so simple that they become trite and untrue. For example, a very common finding home story that you see in some Christian films is, my life was difficult. I rebelled. Things became worse and worse. I hit a crisis. Then I found Jesus. Now I have a great life. And like that's the storyline. So my life was difficult. I rebelled because of that. Things became worse and worse. The crisis occurred. In the crisis, I find Jesus. Life goes on. And it's like this fairy tale ending. Except ask yourself, is that actually true? I mean, people who come from very, very complicated pasts, who hit very serious crises. When they find Jesus, is everything just solved? Oh, things are transformed, absolutely. People find a companion to be with them. They find the presence of Jesus, and that does transform things. But life is often still quite complicated. Life is still often quite messy. People find that their past sometimes means that their option A for their life is no longer available and they've got to opt for option B. Sometimes bridges which have been burnt before remain burnt, and things don't just change. It's not the fairy tale, is it? And as storytellers, we have to find ways to nuance our stories so that people actually genuinely recognize themselves in them. That they say, actually, this is my story. It's a story I can relate to, and it's a story which in some way gives me hope. So what am I saying? As we create Christian media, we say, what makes a Christian? Well, there's some lenses which we use. We invite it to imagination. We undergird that with resurrection hope. And we say, is this content true? And truth is relational. Then we ask the question, what about the goodness that is created through this? And John, I think that's your cue.
Yeah, sure. I think the reason this is fundamentally important as well, especially when we talk about truth, is because in our conversations with Christian media organizations, when we talk about what makes this distinctly Christian, we're very quick to jump straight to sort of cognitive rational arguments. Well, does it contain the gospel as far as I understand it? Have we led people through the sinner's prayer? What we're trying to cultivate is a bit more of an incarnational approach to truth, in the sense of what does it mean to follow Jesus? I mean, I would long for nothing more than just a sort of a religion that required me to do these 10 things, and if I could do these 10 things, I'd won the day. I'd done everything I was supposed to do, and life would be much simpler, right? But I think most of us know that life is far more complex than that. It's very messy, and even as we navigate through the Bible, we don't get the impression that everything's simple. I remember sort of one of my first experiences with reading the Bible was Proverbs, as many people sort of encounter that pretty quickly, because Proverbs is a nice, simple, conventional book for many people. I often refer to sort of the proverbial wisdom as fridge magnet wisdom, because it's when you walk into someone's kitchen, there's usually a little fridge magnet with a proverb written on it, and it's very simple wisdom. Proverbs says to us, if you do the right thing, good things will happen to you, and if you do the wrong thing, bad things will happen to you. There's only two ways: the way of blessing, the way of curses, the path of the wise or the path of the fool. But of course, when you look at the Bible, Proverbs isn't the only book of wisdom. You also have a book called Job, and Job complicates Proverbs quite substantially, because in the book of Job, you have a person who's done everything right according to conventional wisdom. Here's a man who's done everything according to God's will and purposes, and everything kind of implodes. His life gets messy, it gets hard, devastating things happen to him, and you're left with this question of, okay, so it is possible then to navigate life doing everything right and still having everything wrong happen to you in return. And your response is to try and figure out how to worship in the midst of that. And I love the book of Job, because I sort of intuitively think that this is where many people find themselves located in life, especially those who are trying to connect on some level with the Christian message by going, what does God want for me? And when people encounter Christian stories, particularly as represented through Christian media mediums, they're looking for not just the truth as far as we understand it, but they're looking for a story that can make sense of the challenges that they face in daily life. So they're not just looking necessarily for proverbial wisdom, they're looking sometimes for Job's wisdom. What do I do when my life falls apart? You've also got then Ecclesiastes, which kind of comes in. Ecclesiastical wisdom is kind of like, look, I've really tried everything and now meaningless, everything is meaningless. And we can be quite quick to dismiss that, I think, to maybe too easily, the sense of, Solomon was having a terrible day when he wrote that book. But that is also where a lot of people find themselves. A lot of our listeners, a lot of our viewers find themselves in this position where they're going, my life doesn't make sense anymore. I've experienced a great deal of pain, a great deal of hurt, a great deal of complexity, and I'm not entirely sure that it's worth carrying on. And so what do we have to say as producers of Christian content? What do we have to say to all these range of people in the kind of the messiness of life? And one of the things we're trying to communicate through sort of this threefold refrain of truth and goodness and beauty is that when it comes to trying to communicate the moral texture of life through media, we need to ask ourselves, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? What is it that we're trying to accomplish in the lives of people? Are we trying to encourage them to sort of live a particular way, to change certain behaviors so that they can practice a certain style of living? That may well be a part of it. But the fundamental question for me that sort of resounds in my head when I start to create, particularly in a media context, is what is the shape of a life that's been touched by the transforming love of Jesus? Like, what is the shape of a life that's been touched by the transforming love of Jesus? And this begins to then elicit sort of a whole new methodology for creating content, because we begin to imagine what that looks like and how we might be part of the process and story. So, if Christian content's to be genuinely truthful, it has to be truthful, like Brian said, about the full range of human experience. But if it's to be good, and I mean good not just in an aesthetic sense here, I mean good in a moral sense or an ethical sense, what virtues are we conveying to people, then it must convey a goodness that recognizes the complexity of being a human being. We are neither unquestioningly good nor irredeemably bad. We are light and shadow. There's a beautiful author, a guy by the name of Jonathan Sacks. He's a rabbi from the UK. He actually passed away a couple of years ago. But in one of his books, he has a sentence where he says, the most disturbing thing about the Bible is not just that all of the heroes have flaws, but also that all of the villains have virtues. And his point was simply that there is no way you can read the Bible and be left with this impression that there are good guys and bad guys. There are just people wrestling with their inherent goodness, their inherent darkness. And if we can come to a place where we recognize that this is actually the human condition, this is everybody on a daily basis waking up, choosing what kind of person am I going to be today? Am I going to be a good person, a bad person? Am I going to feed the light in me or feed the darkness in me? Then we can begin to share stories and cultivate content that leads people into maybe the mess and complexity of life, but in a way that draws out of them hope and curiosity, and even, dare I say, sort of optimism in the midst of what often people find themselves quite a cynical position. So to convey sort of a picture of genuine human goodness and flourishing, we must hold this tension, I think, between both calling people to something better, which is very important, but also embracing the messiness of where people actually are. I mean, Brian's sort of mentioned this a little bit, but I remember when I came to faith, I was 15 or 16, Jesus became very real to me. And I remember one of the first sermons I ever listened to was wonderful, very, very inspiring, but complete nonsense. I came to realize, because what happened was the preacher was essentially saying, if you've had a hard and a difficult life, and at that point I felt like I had, then come to Jesus and everything will be okay again. I mean, what a sales pitch, really. That was brilliant. I was sold hook, line, and sinker. The problem, of course, is that it wasn't true. I came to Jesus, encountered God in a very powerful way, and then woke up the next morning and all of my problems were still there. So I kind of wanted to know the refund policy on salvation. How do I get out? Because the story wasn't truthful necessarily. But what it did do was begin to cultivate in me a sense of virtue, a sense of goodness, a sense of morality, that I could approach life in a very, very different way, that suddenly my troubles hadn't ended, my sorrows weren't gone, but there was something new there. There was something powerful with me. So why am I saying any of this? Brian's already mentioned, we don't want to kind of labor this point, but one of the major criticisms that comes in the face of Christian media, particularly heard it in terms of Christian media in Australia, is that it simplifies and trivializes the human experience, oftentimes, leaving people feeling guilty that they are unable to live up to such a high moral standard set to them by certain spiritual communities. So, example, this is a sort of a pet hate of mine, but in Christian movies, the protagonists are always beautiful, articulate, and usually kind of win at the end of the day, right? They go through a couple of small trials, but at the end of the day, don't worry, they win. But I mean, I look at some of these stories and go, well, what does it have to say to a single mother who's left her violent husband and is now living on welfare and unable to feed her children? What does this say to a set of parents who have just lost their child to suicide as a result of bullying that's taken place in a Christian school? How does some of these trivial ways of telling beautiful stories impact the very lives of the one that we're actually trying to comfort, empower, and inspire? And so when our content begins to take the shape and the texture of something that is both true in a relational sense and good in a human sense, what we begin to do is tell the stories that people engage deeply with, because they can find themselves in that story. If you listen to songs, if you listen to watch movies, TV shows, read books, the ones that leave the most powerful legacy in your heart and mind are the ones where you can see your own shape and form somewhere in that story. And so when it comes to producing content that leaves a mark, it's about opening up enough space for people to be able to step in and go, yes, I can hear my voice in that story. I can see my face in that story. I can see my mess all over the shape of what's being said here. And whilst it doesn't necessarily fix all my problems, it certainly gives me an avenue to begin to talk and engage about what they are. What we wanted to do now, just briefly, kind of have a bit of an interlude, is Brian and I have been part of creating a number of media projects now over the last sort of 5 or 6 years. One of them, Brian alluded to, was a biblical literacy project we developed for Christian teachers across Australia. And it was called Open Book. And what we wanted to do, we'll speak a little bit about it afterwards, but what we wanted to do with this project was open up the biblical narrative to, I think it was about 9,000 teachers or something that were going to be exposed to this. And we knew that these teachers would be probably a little hostile to being trained in the Bible because they're Christians and they already knew everything. But we thought we want to capture their imagination. And we want to do that not by just conveying truth in a propositional sense, or, you know, conveying sort of moral virtue and goodness by saying, here's the things you must believe and here's the things you must do. We actually want to create space for the diversity of thought, for diversity of opinion, for dialogue. And Brian and I do that quite well together because we often, I mean, we're different. I'm not sure if you've noticed, we're different demographics. So Brian's
I'm a little younger than John is, yeah.
Brian is double my age. But that often catches people off guard because we do a lot of presentations and things together. I'm a millennial, he's a boomer, and we don't always agree. And so eventually I managed to talk Brian around, but usually we start off in a place that's quite fractious and we debate ideas. And instead, you know, when we present at conferences and things like that, instead of kind of wrestling with it all beforehand and then presenting a unified view whenever we speak, we decided quite early on, no, we're actually going to present contrasting views and try and model what it is to see things a little bit differently, but in a positive way, and hope that actually there are people in the midst of that can find their own space, whether it be sort of on one of the different sides or somewhere in between, like giving people space. So what I'm going to do now, we had a little technical issue before. We've got a video to show you. I can't put it up on the screen because the sound wasn't working. I'm going to pop it in the chat, a link to the video. You can watch it on Vimeo. I've just popped it through there. It's only a couple of minutes long. So what we'll do now is we'll just, we'll turn our mics off for 3 minutes, give you a chance to watch it. And when we come back, Brian will pick up on some of the themes that are inside that. Okay, so 3 minutes, have a little look at the link that's in the chat.
There are many different analogies that you could use to describe scripture. You could potentially see it as a jigsaw, but not a complete one, a broken one. So many fragmented pieces which seemingly create a confusing picture. But if you focus on it, you begin to realize that each piece finds its place within the larger whole, giving us an image of the world according to God's story. The reverse is also true. When we get a glimpse of the bigger picture being drawn. Everyone can hear it.
And that should have finished now, Brian.
Right. So when we're actually doing that little clip there, it was part of his, John has mentioned the Open Book series, which is a biblical literacy project. And it was actually a project that was done on very few dollars. So we talked about creating effective Christian media. And I imagine that some of you are saying, I'm sure we could do great stuff, but we just don't have a huge number of brand to do this with. And fair enough. So maybe to underline that the Open Book project was done in a very, very modest budget. So that particular little sequence there where you like have these jigsaws and, you know, is the Bible a jigsaw puzzle that each piece fits in beautifully in some way and you see a big picture in the end. And if you know the big picture, you can understand the smaller parts, or should we view it as this mosaic, a number of beautiful pieces that are broken in some way in themselves, but they fit together really well. Well, we thought through, how do you want to do that, the mosaic part of it? Now, videographer basically, tried a number of things, and they started to cost a bit of money, and then came up with this just really simple solution. And she said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a plate, I'm going to smash it in the shower. So she just took a plate and she smashed it in the shower. And as it was smashing, she set up all the video equipment and she just filmed that. So it's a genuine filming of actually a plate being smashed and the pieces just shooting all over the place. She captures that on video and pieces that together. So how much did that cost us? It was the cost of one plate, which in Australian terms was about $2. So was that a huge amount of money? No, it's about 20 Rand. No, it's not a huge amount of money at all. And it's about creativity. And it's about actually, sometimes our budgets are quite limited, but just let that creativity and imagination work and think through, maybe I don't have multiple millions to do this with, but I can be very effective if I use a little bit of imagination. And I try to use this lens of what will look beautiful, what will really work well and come across really effectively. May I also say, though, that when we use the lens of beauty, we need to start looking at the world slightly differently. So what beauty does Jesus help us to see? Because it seems to me that when we actually tap into the story of Jesus, we spot beauty in unexpected places and things that sometimes other people don't see as being very beautiful. We do spot as being beautiful. For example, South Africa, like Australia, like every part of the world, has been hugely impacted by COVID. And there are so many bad news stories in the midst of that, so many sad things, so many depressing things that have happened there. But I wonder if we've spotted the really beautiful part of that story as well. I don't know exactly how it's rolled out in South Africa, but here in Australia, we've had this phenomenal experience of asking ourselves this question. So who's most likely to be impacted by COVID? Who's most likely to actually die as a result of it? And the answer is quite simple. It's the elderly. They're the most likely to die from it, or those whose health is compromised in some way. So who's the most at risk of actually being killed by this? The elderly and those whose health is compromised. Now, we've had evolutionary theory around for so long that there are many whose default would have been, well, that's the way life goes. It is the survival of the fittest. Like, you need to actually just check your gene pool every now and then. If you aren't strong enough to make this pandemic, well, tough luck. That's just the way that life works. The fittest will survive. Those who aren't strong won't actually make it. And we could have thought like that. But instead, we found, not just in Australia, but in so many countries of the world, there was this very intentional choice made to effectively shut down economies, to shut down the world of production for a while, and just to try and keep everyone safe, keep the most vulnerable safe. Now, that is a beautiful, beautiful story of goodness that we discover in a world that is often very cynical and very harsh, in a world where those in the fringes don't really have much of a show. Actually, we were saying people on the fringes, the most vulnerable, do matter. Actually, the elderly do matter. Actually, those whose health is compromised do matter. And if that means that the economy is messed up for the wealthy, well, so be it, because actually we're taking a different set of priorities here. Not for us not to spot the beauty in that is to actually miss something very significant. It is about Christian truth being lived out. It's a little bit of your kingdom come, your will be done, even in the midst of human tragedy. So when we talk about spotting truth and saying it's relational truth, when we talk about goodness and saying it is about the moral outcome of something, and when we talk about beauty, it's not necessarily always in conventional things. It isn't about everything being tidy and right. It's somehow about the story of Jesus having impacted things for good. And as content creators, when we create content and when we tell our stories in a different way, in a way that's inclusive, in a way that has a bit of a surprise, in a way in which the story doesn't go quite as we intended, in the way in which we spot the Jesus take on some things, then we actually start to open people up because they discover themselves in the midst of the story. And I think it is always about saying, is the content that we're creating, do people somehow see themselves there? Do they get to reflect upon their life in the light of what's been produced? And do they find the hope, a resurrection hope, to in fact have a go, to live differently and to become the better version of themselves? Now, we've spoken about this working out as truth, goodness, and beauty, but John, I'll get back to you at this point to suggest a slightly different order that we might see this working out in.
Well, this is kind of if you will, a methodology for creating content. It's one that we try and use. And if the particularities of content creation are different across industries and mediums. So it's how you create a segment for a radio show is very different to how you create a bit of video content for a TV station. Is very different to how you write and produce a movie or a song. So the particularities are different. But often the methodology will reign true. That the place that we start is, okay, so what is the truth that we are trying to convey here? Is it a gospel truth? Is there something else that we're trying to get across? And once we've defined truth and what it is that we want to say, we then move to the kind of ethical, moral considerations. This is the goodness section. Okay, so how are we going to do that? What are going to be the underlying themes and messages that cultivate the virtues that will lead people to truth? And then really the final consideration for most people is, and how do we make it look beautiful? You know, how do we make it come across in the most powerful way, whether it's a crisp, clean production, microphone, etc., or whether it's a beautiful kind of landscaping, sweeping shots to be shown on the screen. The beautification of it becomes really essential. But when we talk about the methodology for creating content, truth, goodness, beauty, it's important to recognize that our audiences experience this in reverse. So whether we're talking about radio, whether we're talking about TV, books, whether we're talking about music, the first thing to strike our audiences is actually the beauty, is the way that it makes them feel, is the way that it sounds, the way that it looks. It's the shape and texture of its aesthetic. And that becomes really important for us to think about. So whether it is a painting or a song, just think about it for a moment. The first thing that we respond to is how it makes us feel. You know, there's that old kind of Maya Angelou quote. So people won't remember what you say, they will remember how you make them feel. And so as we're preparing whatever content we're preparing, it's very important to have in the forefront of our mind this fundamental observation, which is how it comes across is pivotal. It's everything. There's a quote, I think I have it on the screen actually, from a guy called Alain de Botton. He's not a Christian, but he wrote this is very powerful sort of sentiment, which caught me a number of years ago. And he said, it's in books, poems, paintings, which give us the confidence to take seriously feelings in ourselves that we might otherwise never thought to acknowledge. When I read this, I thought about the quality of, beauty when it comes to presenting content, realizing that the concept of beauty is a missional endeavor. And so we often think about production value or aesthetic when it comes to any given medium as an added bonus. But realistically, this is kind of the missional inroads that people come to experience the reality of what we're trying to say. People don't get hit first and foremost with a set of propositional truths. And actually, these days, if people get hit, front on with a set of propositional truths, what do you think their response is going to be? Most people just throw up their hands in a defense mechanism, go, hey, stop trying to convert me, stop trying to proselytize me, stop trying to force me to think X, Y, and Z. Realistically, our missional medium is to woo people in, not in a manipulative way, but in a way that says, look, before I want to tell you what I believe, I want to show you what life can be when it is lived like this. I mean, this was Jesus. He associated with so many different kinds of people. And the first thing he didn't say was, hey, here's an aspect of your life that I think is conflicting with the law and therefore is completely abhorrent to me. The first thing he said was, hey, let's have some dinner. And let's see how you feel when sat in the presence of the divine, and see how that kind of reshapes your entire experience of life. And this strikes me as fundamentally important when creating content. How are people going to feel when they hear your voice, when they read your writing, when they look at the thing that you've created? And if we can take a certain level of pride, not just from the aesthetic point, but from the experiential aspect of it, and go, look, what I want you to feel is love, is goodness. And through that feeling, I want you to understand the truth that sits beneath it. Then it becomes an entirely different kind of work, doesn't it? I mean, we've just used the little clip there from Open Book as an example, but really that project, it contains 17 sort of short videos ranging between 2 and 8 minutes. And our goal when sort of Brian and I sat down to write that project, we wanted to, it was a biblical literacy project. So the actual goal was we want to help these teachers understand the Bible better, which is a noble goal. And then one way to approach that project would have been, okay, well, here's a theology textbook. It's got 20 chapters. Each one is fundamental to Christian doctrine. Read it, and then you'll know. There you go. That's one approach. The approach that we wanted to take, though, was we wanted people to fall in love with the story of God. Many of them fall in love afresh because they had fallen out of love with it for a bunch of reasons. And we wanted people to move beyond propositional truth into an experience of God through the scripture. And we did this by making it beautiful. And beauty won the day. You know, we did a little thing where we presented it around the country after we developed it. And in many contexts, I was intimately aware that the approach that we'd chosen to take, if we had just stood there speaking about what we thought, would have been received with a degree of confrontational or hostility, not because it was wrong, but because it was new and fresh. But that wasn't the case with what we presented, simply because the medium captivated people before it then tried to make a certain point. And so beauty essentially won the day. And we were sort of able to communicate an entirely different way of approaching scripture in a way that would have normally confronted people, but didn't, because of its sort of its texture and quality. So, you know, the methodology for content creation is truth, goodness, and beauty. But realistically, it's received as beauty, as goodness, and then the truth that lies underneath it. I think I'll hand back to Brian there.
Yeah, so we've been trying to look at this whole question of creating effective Christian content. And as we've been looking through that, we have tried to cover quite a broad range of topics. We have been trying to really say that in the end, we need some lenses to use. We need to recognize how strategic what we do is actually. I mean, we're at this critical point in history. God is using Christian media. We are getting a viewership and a watchership, and way beyond what we might have imagined. And media shapes the way people think of the world. So we have to ask ourselves, is the story we're telling, is it actually valid? Is it genuinely true? Is it genuinely Christian? So if we want to be sure, let's try to think of a couple of lenses that we can work with. And one lens is the truth lens, and try to really just emphasize that truth should be viewed relationally, with all the complexity that actually involves. Christianity has deep answers for people, but they are not trite answers. They're about the quest, and they're about a journey, and they're about finding God, and it's a story of finding home, but the story of finding home is often quite a complicated one. It's a story about goodness, and we should ask ourselves, you know, what is going to be the moral outcome of what it is that we produced? And sometimes we are, certainly, you know, sometimes of some radio stations here, they specialize in outrage and kind of whipping people up because something is terribly wrong or whatever. And you look there and say, but in the end, what did you actually achieve? You just got people very angry, and nothing has actually changed. That's not actually good. That's not particularly helpful. You know, so the Christian lens that you imply with this, say, you know, maybe there's a different way of doing this. Maybe it's a more winsome way that we need to find to do this. And beauty, as John said, is the starting point for most people. And it's the beauty of creating a possibility of a new world. So those of us who are in the creative arts need to recognize that everything we talk about is a vision of life and how life can actually be. What we choose to talk about validates it. If we never talk about some things, then presumably we're saying they're too dark or they're too uncomfortable to talk about. What we give airtime to says actually this is part of our humanity. And when we can be imaginative people who view the future and say, what should God's world look like? We create new worlds of possibility for people. And we can perhaps create a world where people look at what's happening and say, why not? Why couldn't this be? Why couldn't this world actually come about? So we are prophets, we are poets, we're pastors to people, and we try to do that through a lens of truth and goodness and beauty. And I think that's what we've been trying to say today. So I think I'm quite impressed with ourselves. We finished a few minutes early. That doesn't often happen, but it gives a little bit of extra time for some questions if people have them. And maybe I'll hand back to you, Dave, and we can field any questions.
Thanks so much, Brian. Thank you, John. I actually found that very helpful, the truth, goodness, beauty. It's a framework in which, because I'm always a little bit lost as to where to start, and I usually start somewhere and then land up somewhere else, and then wonder where I should have started. Yeah, so I haven't had any questions on the chat. I think I'm sure that there are questions, perhaps clarity, perhaps some of you are involved in projects. I'm hoping that everyone is trying to create creative and effective content. Where are you at? Has this been helpful? Have you got any questions relating to projects that you are currently busy with? Would you like to field them? If you do, just I think at this point what we can do is unmute and if possible switch video on and field your question, because if we see everyone here on the gallery, you know, we can see who's unmuted. Just to go for it. Who'd like to kick the ball off? This is always the difficult one. Who's ready to go? Rudy, got a question here, Rudy van Heerden on the chat. On truth, confusing, wait, let me just open that up here. On truth, confusing dogma on one radio station to the same audience. Sorry, Rudy, I think you need to, if you can just clarify that a little bit, because I'm not really understanding the question. On truth, confusing dogma on one radio station to the same audience. Are you questioning how you clarify those truths? Can you unmute, Rudy, and just give us an audio there? Thanks.
Hi, Dave. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. What I'm referring to there, as far as truth is concerned, was just yesterday I was listening to an online radio station from South Africa, and during the morning broadcast there was a person talking about the end times, and this now has everything and much to do with the whole situation in Eastern Europe at the present moment. And he gave a full explanation of to what it was all about according to him. And then he made a very clear statement, and apparently very well researched, and he's convinced of that, and I don't have a problem with that, that we are not looking at a early rapture of the church, for example. This is now the one. And now there was an audience listening to that, and what he said was very convincing, and it was very good content. Then just about 2 hours later, another person in another program just spoke about the same thing. And it was also the same topic, and then a very strong emphasis on the rapture of the church. Now, the same listener listening to two things, and he's looking, the listener is looking for the truth. That's why he's listening to this whole thing. But now he's confused as far as his belief is concerned. And I think the moment we move in that direction and we're not very careful about this, then we do more damage than good. And I think when it comes to creative and effective Christian content, we must be very careful when we talk about things like this. And that is that we have to make it very clear that people don't always believe the way we do, but steer clear from that, and talk about the other facts that there is agreement on. And I think if the moment we even though the programs, and both the programs I'm referring to, were, as far as beauty is concerned, I think it was fine. As far as goodness is concerned, it was fine. But the moment it came to the truth factor, it was very interesting to a point. And then there was this whole thing of the goodness disappear and the beauty disappear, because at the end of the day, what is the truth? Because now we have two people talking about the same thing, different opinions, but both of them say this is the truth.
Great. Thanks, Rudy. Brian, John, just how do we as Christian broadcasters present controversial theological conclusions or topics?
So I'll make a couple of comments there, and John will probably have some as well. First, I'd say we have different audiences, don't we? And I think you have to ask, my radio station, my TV station, whatever it is it primarily missional, or is it primarily for the church? And if you're primarily missional, so for example, here in Perth, we have Sunshine FM, and it's a station which is primarily missional in its intent. So it has a fair amount of Christian content, but it also has what we might call secular music, and it presents the ordinary day-to-day news and everything else, and it reaches a vast number of people. Now, if you were to put that squabble onto that, you would just kill its missional impact in one shot. People would say, oh my goodness, I was just getting softened to the Jesus community, and now I find that actually they argue endlessly about some end time that who knows whether it will or won't happen. That is just very unhelpful. So I think you need real clarity in terms of, what's our focus. If it's a missional focus, then I would just say, if a listener phones in and they want to go down that track, just find a way to say, bless you, very interesting, but let's talk about something else at this point in time. Like just quietly shift the topic away, because this is not where we wanted to come out at. If, however, here in Australia, and I imagine in South Africa as well, we have radio stations that primarily are for the Christian community. And they're there for them, and they are very popular, for example, in many small towns in Australia where there sometimes are no churches at all, and so the radio station becomes the church for that particular community. And then I think it is actually perfectly appropriate to sometimes dive into some topics in greater depth. But I think what we have to be very, very, it's all about tone, isn't it? So tone can say, oh my goodness, there's a fight here and someone's right and someone's wrong, or it can be, let's be curious. Rather than judgment, rather than rushing to judgment, let's actually rush straight to curiosity. So this is what you think. At no point am I going to say, you're right, that's the truth. I'm going to say it's really interesting, and I'm interested that you feel like that. And maybe beneath that, we can introduce this wonderful idea, and it's a perfectly valid idea, that the rabbis of old, when they debated about the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, they used to speak about the 70 faces of the text, which basically meant that whenever you spoke about something in the Bible, they would have like a Bible scholar or Bible student, and they'd say, so what do you think about the story of Noah, or whoever it was? And a person would give their view, and they'd say, that's very interesting, that's wonderful. Now someone else. And they would give another view, and they'd say, that's good, that's really good. And now someone else. And they would say, until you've heard the 70 faces of the text, you haven't really understood it well. And in other words, they would move away from trying to lock into this is what it has to be, into a far more this is interesting, there are possibilities, and in the end, you're responsible adults. You can take, the version that you find the most interesting. And I think we can do that. And in controversial things, I think we have to do that in a way, let's talk about the controversial, but let's do it always charitably. And let's move away from someone being like, I'm right, you're wrong, that's it, close the topic, because that just creates hostility and it's a very poor model for how to explore truth well. I don't know, John, do you have something else there?
Yeah, it is a very important question. It's challenging because we all like to feel that we have a monopoly on the truth, don't we? It's one of the things about the word. Even the word is we have the truth. But one of the reasons that we use a methodology for truth that we do, which is the truth is not about ascending to a set of beliefs, but about following the one who is truth, is precisely to avoid contentious issues which destroy Christian communities. That's the whole point. So moving away from truth as propositional to truth as embodied, like actually one of the common criticisms people have is, oh, well, doesn't that open the way for relativism? You know, everyone can just believe whatever they want. But actually it does the very opposite. If you take the example of the question of eschatology, rapture, right? So is there a rapture? Is it next week? If there is it next year? Is it 10 years? Those are all very contentious issues, which are very theological and biblical, and we have to wrestle with them. But to use truth in terms of following Jesus, the answer is actually the same. What does it mean to follow Jesus today? What does it mean to follow Jesus next week? What does it mean to follow Jesus in 10 years? If that's the truth that we're communicating, because that's the value that we have, then the approach is consistent, regardless of whether we find ourselves in a moment where there's fires and floods and war and plague. The truth is the same. And so, you know, moving from propositional to incarnate truth, which is just moving from a set of beliefs to an image of Jesus that we follow, and how we communicate that becomes very, very important.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, John. I think we've gone a long way. There's a follow-up question on that from the CBN group. You know, the danger that relational truth may be based more on my feelings and emotions versus what may actually be truth. And anyway, I'll leave that with you, because again, it's how we define truth.
Yeah. And so I think a biblical view of truth is actually that truth somehow is relational. So for example, let's go back to what was put there. So here's a listener who has a particular view of the eschaton and of eschatology. Another listener has a quite different view of it, and they talk about that, and it's amicable, and it's respectful, and it's caring, and that's rounded truth in some way. Like in the end, you're going to find one of them more convincing than the other. But if you have that discussion and actually the one screaming at the other and the other getting really defensive and angry, and then suddenly people burst into tears and they won't speak to each other, no matter what you say, that's not biblical truth, because that is a violation of biblical community in a very deep way. And that's allowed something to actually intervene between, actually Jesus says, I am the truth, and following me, you actually find truth. So I think for truth, we need to be quite rigorous in how we think about it. And I always talk about the three orthos. So when people sometimes talk about truth as orthodoxy, orthodoxy is one aspect of the orthos we should look at. But let's remember, orthodoxy without orthopraxy, in other words, without right praxis, and without orthopathy, without right feeling, is not actually truth. So truth has three components. It's why biblical truth is much more complicated than just straightforward propositional truth, because Jesus won't have any of kind of like, you can say the right thing and you can be living something quite different, and that's still true. I mean, Jesus challenges that the whole time. And in the Bible, to be truthful is about living truthfully. And it is about orthodoxy, which is right thinking. It is about orthopathy, which is about right living. And it is about, orthopathy is about right feeling. And it's about orthopraxy, which is about right living. And so whenever you talk about truth, just say, okay, so what's that outplay in life? Which is why we spoke a bit about goodness. What goodness does this create? What does this do in terms of thinking? Is this robust? Does it stand a truth as correspondence test? And are we doing it with the right motivation? What's the feelings behind that? And sometimes we think that it is okay to tick the truth as correspondence block. That's sub-Christian. Christians have a much more stretching requirement of truth. And if somehow this doesn't work at the realm, I don't live this out, if I don't kind of feel this out, then it's not actually true in the sense of I'm a disciple of Jesus, and truth is about following the one who is the truth.
Mm.
Yeah, I think this whole question of truth, I mean, Pilate battled with it, and I think that it goes on because, as you say, it is a lot more complicated, and we'd always like to make things simple because that's how we work. When we've got everything buttoned up, it just seems easier.
There's a story in the Bible, I think it's Matthew 18, of Peter and his declaration of Christ. Most of us are familiar with that story. It's quite a common one that's preached, where Jesus is asking, who am I? Who do people think that I am? And all the disciples come in and say, you could be this guy, this prophet. And then, Peter, I love Peter because he comes in and says, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Beautiful, accurate, cognitive response. You are the Messiah. He gets the answers right, which is brilliant, which is what we're kind of looking for when we say things like biblical truth or truth, with a capital T. We're looking for the right answer. The problem with that story, though, is if you keep reading, it all falls apart because only a few verses later, the words that Jesus is saying to Peter, instead of, blessed are you, son of, Simon, son of Jonah, he's saying, get behind me, Satan. So it turns very quickly. And the reason that it turns is because whilst Peter's got the answer right, you are the Son of the living God, Messiah, the Son of the living God. When Jesus starts to talk about his suffering and death, Peter is absolutely horrified and saying, hang on, no way. Like, I just said that you were the Messiah. You said that was right. And there is absolutely no way the Messiah will be crucified and humiliated, not on my watch, because whilst he had the right answer, his experience of it was completely different. And so there's often a bit of a dualism that comes when we talk about truth, to think the truest truth is the cognitive truth, is getting the answer right. But that story with Peter shows that you can get the answer right, and it means very little if you're unable to follow through that belief into the reality of what it means to follow Jesus, which is actually to follow Jesus to the cross. And so this is where truth becomes very complicated on a relational level, because yes, the answers are important, fundamentally important, but equally important is our lives, the relational sort of aspect of our lives. And will we follow Jesus to the cross, or will we just get the answer right that yes, you're the Messiah? Like, which one is more valuable to us?
Right. Thanks, John. Further questions. There is, if you look at reactions, there's a thing you can raise your hand if you want to, raise your hand here using that. Put your question, then I'll ask you to put your questions in. Just from my side, I struggle a little bit. Where do we start with, we've looked a bit now at the truth, the other side, the beauty. Where do we start there? We've decided on our propositional truth. How do we, where do we bring the beauty in from? Does that come naturally? Is that a struggle? Just, can you just talk me through a little bit on that one?
Why don't you go first this time?
Yeah, I mean, it's different. That's a very question that's very particular to the type of content that you're creating, isn't it? And it's particular not only to the type of content that you're creating, but the type of audience that you have. So recognizing the audience is pretty critical in that context. So with a lot of the projects we've produced in the last few years, and there's been quite a few of them now, largely in the education sector, we've done an enormous amount. We've also done some in the media sector and sort of a few other smatterings of things. It really comes, I mean, this is a bit subjective. So this is how, as a sort of a project manager, how I like to produce things is how, like, what is going to connect with people's heart and soul? What are the mediums by which people begin to feel things really deeply? Because I know that once you can crack open someone's heart, you can then begin to speak to them in a really powerful way. It's like the analogy I used of the sermon at the beginning of my sort of faith journey. It was a total lie, but it was so emotional that it cracked me open. And even, when I came to realize that, okay, this is not actually true, what he said to me, there was an encounter there that I couldn't deny. I couldn't deny that I had felt something very powerful. So, for us, it comes down to the landscapes that we choose in terms of the footage that we put together. It comes down to like choosing localized footage so that people can find, like, oh, I recognize that place. I recognize that kind of, that looks familiar, it looks home, it looks something I can identify with. The music, when we produce resources, is very, very important. In fact, we're just looking at commissioning a whole range of new music for some upcoming projects, because we want actually to be in control of how music plays its part all the way through videos. Particularly, we want, if we're making a particular point, we want the music to sound a particular way, because and that can in one sense be a bit of an emotional sort of journey. We're trying to manipulate people's emotions, but realistically, it's the creative arts that actually enable us to see truth in a way that we would never have seen it before. You know, music, if you enjoy music, you know that music opens you up to experiences you don't have from reading, or you don't have from talking to people. It's a completely sort of transcendent experience a lot of the time. And so it's not a very helpful answer, but really it for us, it comes down to what it looks like and what we want people to feel. It comes down to what they're listening to and how that's beginning to shape. And you know, as theologians, the script is fundamentally important as well. So the actual words that we're saying and what words elicit certain feelings. I mean, we had a bit of a debate recently with a particular client that were writing some theology for them. And there was what was the word, Brian? We had created a phrase where we talked about Christian communities being gathered under the cross, like with the people gathered by the cross. And they wanted to use the word bound by the cross. You know, there's a small sort of theological tension, but for us, we said, well, there's a big difference between the word gathered and the word bound. You know, one gives us a feeling of being restricted and wrapped up and tied up and not free to kind of express ourselves. One talks about us gathering in community with other people. And so it can come down to things that are as minute as that, but stitch them all together and they create something quite intentional and quite powerful as well. So,
and one of the really frustrating things about doing things for clients is that clients don't always listen to counsel.
They didn't listen to us.
So we gave them our point of view and they just said no. so in the end, bound it is. But like we think that the other would have been much better.
Yeah. No, that was helpful to me. Thank you. Right. More questions. Yes, CBN again, please. Hi,
everyone. Sorry, we had load shedding, so we've just fired up the generator, and that's why we had a little gap there. But good to be back. So sorry if this has come up already in the last 10 minutes, but yeah, thanks for everything. It's been great. Just a quick question about, you know, as content providers or content creators. I'd just love to hear your thoughts about the kind of experience side of it. What I'm getting at is I love all that about beauty and truth and all that, but you know, if you're a Netflix creator, let's say, I'm guessing mostly your measure ends where views ends, if you know what I mean, like views and generating money. Like if that's done, if a piece of content has been successful, it's had lots of views, lots of people purchasing it, end of story. For us, who obviously have a goal that's beyond that, and it includes that, but it finishes beyond that, if you know what I mean. Like, where does this sort of taking the experience of beauty, truth, goodness, moving that into a place where that is missional? Where do we how do we measure that as content creators? Like, I guess the question is, how do we measure success? Because even a whole lot of views is not necessarily meaning that we've done what we set out to do in the mission of that piece of content. And so have you just got any thoughts about, you know, how to measure? Because obviously if we can, even before we start making the content, it sort of strikes me that we should be thinking to the measure point, like, well, what are we going to see as the successful? What are we wanting people to feel? And how are we going to know they felt that? And what are we wanting them to do? Those kind of questions.
Yeah. So let me make an observation. So the observation is that you always need to differentiate between the short-term outcome and the longer-term impact of something. So if you want to peddle half-truths, very often because people have a kind of complexity bias, so anything that's a bit more complicated, people kind of veer away from. You know, we want things to be simple. The trouble with that bias is that things actually are complex. So it doesn't matter how much you try to make them seem simple, they actually aren't. So in the end, you're peddling an untruth. Now, in the short term, you might get lots of views and lots of likes and everything else. And it can always be like John's experience that he goes into a church and it's a transforming experience in some ways. He goes there and he gets promised. I mean, it's a wonderful promise, isn't it? Like you give your life to Jesus and every problem just drops away. And the immediate response is great response, because that's just wonderful if that actually happens. But then you pick up the tab afterwards, don't you? You know, people saying, yep, and that wasn't true, was it? Now, in John's case, mercifully, he had enough experiences to still hold him in there. But we live in an era, and I don't know what it's like in South Africa, but here in Australia, the phenomenon of churchless faith is becoming enormous, absolutely enormous. People who say, yep, Jesus, yes, but frankly, church, no. And if you dig into why they say that and why they do that, the answer is almost always, I was peddled a half truth. It seemed wonderful at the time, got the crowds in, very enthusiastic. But you know what? Just doesn't work in the longer term. So I'm not giving up on Jesus, but I'm very disillusioned about the community, and I'm backing away from that. Now that, I mean, when we talk about Australia, we're now talking about millions of people who are in that category. And to not actually factor that into the cost of half-truths is very poor accounting. So you need to differentiate between what gets the immediate like and the immediate buzz, and the question of, is this actually true? Can we actually defend this for the longer term? Are we happy with this? And frankly, if it doesn't pass the truth, and listen, we focus on truth as relationship. Don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that there's no rational aspect to truth. I'm not trying to suggest that. But I'm just saying that a definition of truth that is purely rational is not enough. But if it doesn't pass the truth, the goodness and the beauty test, it's not likely to pass the long-term test. So be willing to think long-term.
I think the question of metrics is actually really important as well. I think you're really right in that there are some much bigger metrics that we have as Christian content providers that go beyond views. So if you produce something that you think is wonderful, it's very disheartening to get 3 people watching it, feel like it's an absolute disaster. That doesn't actually mean it's a failure, you know, by any means whatsoever. But I think there's also wisdom in being attuned to how many people are engaging with the content that you're producing, not because it necessarily tells you whether it's good or true or not, but because it tells you whether people are actually engaging with what you're saying. So it might not be a problem of truth. It might be a question of engagement. Are you actually engaging with people effectively? So one of the things I've noticed over here through some of the TV shows that become very popular, so I'm talking about non-Christian TV shows, for example, that a lot of people would find abhorrent and appalling and terrible, but they get a lot of views. And there is one Christian response which says, oh my goodness, they just get views because we live in a carnal, debased society and everybody likes looking at these awful things. That's one way of seeing it. I think that would be a very shallow way to analyze it, to be perfectly honest, because the reason people watch things is not just to see all the scandalous things happening on their screen, but people actually engage on a deep level with certain themes and concepts. And so, you know, as a media analyst or whatever, I just sit there watching these shows doing is I actually am always trying to ask the question, so why is this so popular? What is it about this story that's capturing people? What is it that people are bringing in? What questions is this answering for people, or what questions are this asking that no one else is asking? And you know, the popularity of certain things can show us not just whether it's true or not, but can show us where people are actually located in their story, in their hearts, in their minds. And so for Christian providers, it's actually important for us to factor into our metrics. Are we not just saying things that we believe to be true, but are we saying things in a way that actually engage people? Because in the world of media, you can be saying something that's true and no one's listening. And realistically, who cares? You. But our goal is not just truth, it's connection. And truth and connection are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they are tied and bound together in the media world. That's the whole jam. What are we saying? And how are we conveying it? And so whilst views aren't everything, they're certainly important in terms of telling us whether we're hitting the mark or not, if that makes sense in the worlds of people. Anyway.
And perhaps one other factor to think of as well is, sometimes you get like a really large viewership from something, but because you said so very little, even though lots of people saw it, it's not going to make very much difference because it actually wasn't saying very much. It was funny, it was amusing, but like people don't take anything else away from that. They think that was very funny, but there's nothing to actually hold on to at the end of that. Sometimes it's better to say, actually, there weren't quite as many people, but what was covered was actually transforming. And the impact that has on people's lives is actually much more substantial in the longer term. And so sometimes slightly more complex programs, they don't appeal to everyone, but the people that they do appeal to, they actually engage with them very deeply and they make a long-term difference. So there are a lot of variables to think about. I mean, obviously, if no one's watching, then you need to ask some very hard questions. But to be totally driven by viewership is probably a mistake, especially as it's quite easy to create content nowadays. And I think that we do need to recognize that we're moving more and more into a niche market. So certainly over here in Australia, we're recognizing that we're the radio station for all this part of the country. And, we try to do everything is probably not the way forward, that it's not quite as expensive as it was to do things in the past. And it is possible to create substations and sub-markets and to be reasonably focused on what you do there. And you might have a smaller viewership, but it's quite an engaged viewership or listenership. And that can be really very impacting.
A good example to answer to the question as well is, so 2016 was the year, of the controversial elections in the US, with Donald Trump getting elected. It was also the year of Brexit in the UK and all the tension there with sort of Britain leaving the EU and a whole bunch of other kind of turbulent stuff, fires and all that sort of stuff. And the number one article in the New York Times was an article entitled "Why You Will Marry the Wrong Person," and it was number one by an enormous gap. So whilst the world is kind of spinning and going crazy and everyone's fighting and arguing with each other, there's this one article by a popular philosopher that talked about why you'll marry the wrong person, and it obviously struck a chord with people where they're at, what they're struggling with, what they want to know, and so that always stands in my mind as a wonderful example of someone who, despite the chaos of the world, knew exactly what people were wanting to know, and it was completely different to what everyone else thought was important at the time. And so, part of our goal is maybe discerning. Yeah, we can spend an enormous amount of time writing about the war or the floods or the famine or the plague, things that people are interested in. And it is important to engage with those things, but very much so. But always being attuned to, but there are also fundamental questions that people will never stop asking. And that is part of our work as well. So.
Great. Yeah, no, I think that was very helpful. Last question from anyone. We're getting towards the end of our track time. This is great. Yeah, thank you.
Not sure if you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Oh, great. No, I just really wanted to say thank you to Brian and John for what you've shared with us today. It has been the truth, the beauty, and the goodness of the way you have navigated. Sometimes we're disciples of the poor need to be fed, or we need to be hospitable, we need to do this radio program, we need to get things done. But you from Australia are teaching us the gospel of going to the heart, the mind, and the core of what motivates us to do what we do. But you've put it so well and challenging. We're actually going to look at things differently, because sometimes, the Bible can be Bible bashing, which is a terrible thing. And thank you for what you've put across to us. It's the beauty of story, and you challenged us. Thank you.
No problem.
Thanks.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Any final comments, Brian, John, as we come to end? That was Michelle, Good News Community Radio in Durban. Or anyone else want to put a hand up and have a final comment? No. Over to you,
for us to give a final comment, could I just really say thank you for what you're doing. Don't be afraid to experiment a little bit. The thing that I sense is that, it's a new day. It really is the 21st century. It really is not 2022. And we don't have to be trapped in models from the past. I sense that for the church, it's a new age. I don't know just how the church has been impacted by COVID in your part of the world, but if it's like in Australia, everyone just knows, It's going to be a pre-COVID, post-COVID kind of worshiping community. It's not going to be exactly the same. And there's going to be a lot more that's done online. There's going to be a lot more creativity. And we're going to have to view ourselves as being able to think in creative new ways. So have a go. Really encourage each other. Like, I mean, if it sucks and it doesn't work, and that's okay. And like, we all make mistakes sometimes. It's not the end of the world. It's much worse if you don't just have a go. And it's becoming easier to create content than it used to be. So let's experiment and let's set ourselves free to do that.
John, anything to finish off with there? Thanks, Brian.
No, just thank you for having us and listening to us. And I mean, my conviction all the time is that we need more beauty in the world. We really do. Like, it is difficult at the minute, isn't it, to just look around, and it's easy to feel fear. It's easy to feel afraid. And when people switch on their TVs, switch on their radio, it would be nice for them to encounter not a trivialized version of the world. So not one that skirts around the suffering or pretends that it doesn't exist, but one that knows that there is something much more powerful at work, and that's the hope of Jesus. So encouraging to you all. Thank you for having us.
Amen. Thank you so much, John. Thank you, Brian. It's been a great session. I think we've kind of had a glimpse beyond our close horizons to somewhere greater, and I think new possibilities have been opened up. Before I just conclude, let's just pray. Father, I give you thanks. Thank you, Lord, for your creativity that you've placed in each of us. Thank you for your Holy Spirit. And Lord, may we be sensitive to you as we create content and share your message of love and beauty and truth. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you. And next week, we have the final workshop in this series. It'll be the same time next week. The speaker will be Greg Kleur. It'll be something a little bit different from today, a practical approach to effective governance. So this is really looking at corporate governance and how we can run our organizations effectively and excellently. Thank you for everyone who's been part of this, and thank you especially for Brian and John for joining us. Enjoy your evening as we head into the rest of the day. Bless you. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.